Okay. We'll go far as we can.
Oh.
You ready?
I'm ready.
Just to bring you up to speed a little bit from our past two lessons.
Can I stop you just a minute? I didn't see our guest come in.
I'm not a guest.
Well, you're a guest of the class, aren't you?
No, she's a member.
Well, I'm sorry.
Wrong seat.
She's sitting in the wrong chair.
Wrong seat, they've been sitting right.
You've been sitting right there.
All I have, there's only one seat, so when he came with me, so I sat here next to him.
This is mine.
Sorry, I messed you up.
That's what happens.
I'm not gonna ask any more questions ever.
Hey, Bill, your feet's on TV.
I even know you're safe.
Am I red?
That's because of that.
Am I red? Now that I'm plenty red, we're gonna let Beau go ahead.
Okay, we'll get underway here. Just a real quick preview or review of where we've been. We had two class sessions before. One was from the creation to the flood, which was a total of 1,656 years, and then from the flood to Abraham, which was a total of about 427 years, and then that placed Abraham being born somewhere around 1921 BC. As we mentioned before, he was born about midways between the creation story and the coming of Christ. So we can use him as a benchmark to step down to the coming of Christ, which occurred, of course, about 4 BC. To backtrack just a little bit, I think it would be in order to trace the genealogies of some of these people and place them in the nations that they established as they came through the course of human history. Of course, Cain was the killer of his brother Abel, and God placed a curse on Cain, and he had several generations after him, and the people that came after him were very productive people as far as helping to install culture into the human race. And if we want to just be strictly honest about not honest, but factual about the time frames, probably the Egyptian people that were responsible for the pyramids came from the seed of Cain. Of course, the seed of Cain were wiped out during the flood when the flood of Noah came, and that took out all the generations of the people that were living on the earth at that time, and left only Noah and his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives to propagate the earth after a total destruction of all of the humankind on the earth, because their deeds were so evil God could not tolerate their existence. After the flood, we had coming out of the ark Noah, of course, which was 600 years old when the flood came, and he and his wife were survivors of the flood. They had 3 children, 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And of course they and their wives survived the flood. So when they came out of the ark after a year and 10 days in the ark, the world began to repopulate itself again, and the family of Noah played a major role in this. They're the only ones that could have, because they survived the flood. And so we had the children of Noah having children, which moved to different parts of the then known world. And I might mention just some of those. The son of Shem had at least 5 sons, and the name of one was Lud, L-U-D, and he was responsible for the children of Shem being in Asia Minor. And then after that, we had Aram and Ashur, and they were mostly in the area of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Then there was Arphaxad and Elam, and they were further east and further south over in the area of where the Garden of Eden was. So the sons of Shem, I may have said Japheth, but the sons of Shem were the parent nation, parent family of the Jews and the Arab nations. Because from Shem came Abraham, and from Abraham came Ishmael, who was the father of the Arab nation, and then Isaac came also from Abraham and Sarah, and they were the fathers of the Jewish nation or Hebrew nation. Then Ham, the son of Noah, had several sons. He had Cush and Canaan, and the sons of Cush, one was very notable, which was Nimrod. Nimrod was born something around 2250 BC, and he became a great leader of several parts of the then known world. He was a mighty hunter. He was a mighty city builder or builder of nations. And he also founded the nation of Assyria, which then had as its capital Nineveh. And Nimrod was the one that built Nineveh. Nimrod also must have been a tremendous leader in the story of the Tower of Babel. And one thing that we were trying to establish as we move through this story of the Bible and the chronological order of it is that to answer the question, is God real and is the Bible true? Well, beginning along about this time, we begin to see secular history giving us evidence of some of these Bible stories being true. And one of them is the Tower of Babel. It was established somewhere around 2200 BC, and the Tower of Babel can still be seen today. I am told, and from the history books, that the Tower of Babel, though it has been through several periods of destruction and renovation, can be seen in the country of Iraq today. It stands about 150 feet high, and while it's in a state of disrepair, it still can be seen as a monument to the past. And it is thought that that Tower of Babel must have been somewhere around 300 feet, maybe even higher than that, when it was first built in the plains of Shinar, which was in Mesopotamia. So, beginning with that, we see the evidence of the nation of the Arab nation and the Jewish nation, and then Ham had the Cush, and Cush having Nimrod. We see the beginning of the Assyrian nation, and also he had other sons, such as Canaan. Canaan became the parent of the Canaanite nation. Many of the Canaanites ruled in the land of Canaan, which is now what we know as Israel. It was also called Israel then because it was named after Jacob when his name was changed to Israel, meaning God with us. And so the Canaanites inhabited the land of Israel. They also, from the seed of Cush, formed the Philistine nation, and the Philistines had continually been in the history of the Jewish nation for thousands of years. Further, after the flood, Noah over-imbibed a little bit in his leftover booze from the ark and got drunk, and during his drunkenness, he exposed himself in his nakedness, and his son Canaan saw that nakedness, and God did not like that well. When Noah came out of his drunken sleep that night, he realized what had happened to himself with his son, and he cursed his son Canaan, and of course Cush was part of the curse. And so that curse being put on Canaan and Cush, Cush then went to Ethiopia and became the parent family of the Ethiopian nation. He had several sons. He had Murray, I'll get it in a minute. Anyway, Lul is one of them, and Miriam, not Miriam, Merzek is what it is. Anyway, I'll have to correct that, but I can't remember how you pronounce it. Anyway, that and Canaan and those three sons became the parent stock of the Ethiopian country, and as we know it to be, they were the progenitors of the African nation. And we wonder sometimes if this is where the black nation came into being. And I don't know the answer to that, except from the book of Isaiah we get an indication from the 18th chapter of Isaiah in verse 2. It mentions the Ethiopian people as being a particular kind of people. And you can look that up and read it for yourself, what Isaiah had to say in Isaiah 18 in verse 2. It's also mentioned in Jeremiah, the 13th chapter, and the 23rd verse, where the question was asked, can an Ethiopian change his skin, or can a leopard change his spots? So we would answer that that's not likely to happen. And that may lead us to believe that this is where the African nation came from, but I'm using my supposition on that and based on the scriptures that I just mentioned to you. Well, after the flood, the country was repopulated by the families that we just mentioned, and I mentioned Shem and Ham. Japheth also had 7 sons, and I mentioned 3 of them. One was Javan, and the children of Japheth were the parent family of the Gentile nations. We've seen already the Jews and the Arabs and the Africans, and now Japheth was the parent of the Gentile nations. And his descendants went all the way from the Persian Gulf over to Greece and East Europe, and inhabited the lands of Asia Minor, especially East Asia Minor. And Jovan and Meshach and Madai were the main sons that inhabited those lands from the family of Japheth. So this is basically a rundown on what you have as far as the countries that were inhabited, the nations that began after the flood. And we've already talked about the Nephilim that lived in the days of the flood, and how that in some way their DNA must have come through the bloodline of one of the children or wives of the sons of Noah. And we don't know exactly which one, but apparently they came through, and it stands to reason that it would have been Ham, because the Nephilim inhabited the land in southern Canaan and near the Dead Sea, not the Dead Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. And so if that was the case, we can understand a little bit about where those giants came from that were inhabiting the land during the time when Joshua was moving into the land of Canaan to conquer the Canaan nation after the exile ended and the Exodus came out of Egypt. Well, let's look back now at the period of time that occurred after the life of Abraham. God told him that it would be 430 years that his family would be exiled in Egypt. They would be in slavery. And so when the time came, the inhabitants of the land of Goshen, which were the children of Jacob, being 70 souls that came down, and Joseph already being in the country, so we call them 71. Joseph married an Ethiopian or an Egyptian and had 2 children named Ephraim and Manasseh. And they became the inheritors of the same tribal position that the sons of Jacob did. You recall Jacob had 12 sons, and I'm sure you can name them, but I'll try to name them for you. You had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin. I left out Joseph because he did not inherit a specific inheritance, but his 2 sons did. So he got a double portion of the inheritance through Ephraim and Manasseh. And they were very significant leaders in the tribal takeover of the land of Canaan when Joshua led the children of Israel into the land of Canaan many years later. Let's look at, for the next few minutes, the story around the exile from Egypt. The exile in Egypt and the exodus from this exile. The children of Israel, which were known as the Hebrews at this time, multiplied very significantly. They had many, many children, and the land of Egypt became filled with the Hebrew people. So much so as the Pharaoh said, we've got to do something about this because they're going to take us over. If they don't take us over, then if we have a war, they will join the adversary and will cause us to be taken into slavery ourselves. So they decided that they would kill all the boys of the Hebrew nation that was born at that time. Well, Pharaoh instructed the midwives to do that, and they were not following instruction too well because they followed God, and their faith in God led them to save the boys, and therefore the number of Egyptians compared to the Hebrews continued to lose, and the Hebrew nation continued to grow. Well, among those, there was a man named Amram and Jochebed who were living down in the land of Goshen in Egypt, and they were goodly people, feared God as Abraham did, and they had a son, and they noticed this son being a goodly child. Well, I had some sons and some daughters too, and all of mine were goodly, and I'm sure that you feel the same way, but nevertheless, they built a little ark, which we call a boat, and hid him down in the cattails, we'd call them cattails, or reeds, in the Nile River, and so that he would survive the death sentence that Pharaoh had put on all the children of the Israelite nation, or the Hebrew nation. So as fate would have it, Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the Nile, which was normal for them because the Nile River was pretty well their mainstay, both for their wildlife, their irrigation water, and their drinking water and sanitation water and so forth. So she observed this baby crying that was in this little ark, and she had her handmaid to go over and fetch him and brought him out, and it turned out to be Moses, as fate may have it. And Moses' sister Miriam happened to be there, and she ran up to Pharaoh's daughter, who was the king's daughter. The Egyptian lady that was there to capture or to take over this little Hebrew child, and she said, would you like me to get a nurse for her? Well, the answer was yes, and so she went and got Moses' mother, and he became her nurse, and Pharaoh's daughter supported her in raising the child Moses. Well, Moses fared quite well in the palace of Pharaoh for 40 years. He went out one day and he saw an Egyptian fighting with a Hebrew, and so he moved on the Egyptian and killed him and buried him in the sand and thought that was the end of the issue. But the next day he went out and there were two Hebrews fighting. And so one of the Hebrews said, are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian yesterday? And so that scared Moses pretty bad. The story got back to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh couldn't put up with that. So Moses had to leave the land of Egypt as a fugitive for murder. And he went into the land of Midian, which was in the eastern part of the Sinai Peninsula, also called the wilderness of Sin or the wilderness of Paran. And he lived there after he had met the daughters of Jethro, bailed water for their stock there, and Jethro thought he was a pretty good sort of fellow to do that, and so he took him in and later gave his daughter Jochebed to be his Moses' wife. And so Moses lived and took care of the sheep and goats for Jethro for 40 years. And he was out there one day in the wilderness, and he saw a bush on fire. And he observed the bush, and it didn't burn up. And so he drew closer to see what the problem was, and God told him out of the burning bush to pull off your shoes, this is holy ground. And Moses did, and God revealed to him what his mission for the next 40 years would be. Moses didn't know it at that time, that it would be that long, or that it would be this consequential, but nevertheless, he listened to God, and God had to prove to him by using his rod to become a snake or serpent, and then also by using his vestige to put his hand into it and pull it out, and it became leprosy. And those two signs were the signs that God was real, and he wanted Moses to do what he told him. Moses didn't want to go to Egypt because he had been there and he was a fugitive from justice. But the Pharaoh that had been after Moses had died, and so a little bit different situation there. And so God told Moses to go down to Egypt, and he didn't want to because he was slow of speech. And so God said, well, take your brother with you, the big brother, Aaron, who was 3 years older than Moses. And so he took Aaron with him down to Pharaoh and said, Pharaoh, God says, let the Jewish people go, let the Hebrew people go. And Pharaoh said, no way. And so God told Moses, he said, well, he's not going to let you take them out easy, but I'm going to prove with my power and a mighty hand upon him, and then when I get through with him, he will let them go. So then came the plagues that came to the Egyptian people. And I don't know whether you can name them or not, but try it. The first one was water into blood. And then the next one was frogs. And then there was lice. And then there were flies. And then there were murrain of the cattle, some kind of plague of the cattle. Now let's stop here just a minute. When this happened, the country of Egypt began to lose its power. If you turn the water into blood, what happens to the fish? They die. And they did die. And so you got a bunch of dead fish in all the waters of Egypt. And people in the Nile Valley depended on fish for their living. So all of a sudden their income, food supply is interrupted. And then you had frogs. Well, the frogs don't want to stay in bloody water, so they came out of the land. And then when God revoked the plague of the frogs, they died. Well, that creates a pretty good stench. And then you had lice coming out of that. And you ever had lice on you, or know somebody that does, or seen them on animals? You've seen dogs and cats with fleas and ticks. Well, that's a similar situation. And this came out into all the land of Egypt. And nobody was exempt from these lice. And then the frogs died. Well, that propagates the flies. And flies feast on dead animals and so forth. And so the flies took over. Well, you know how it is to have a bunch of flies in your house. It's not fun. And you got to constantly fight the flies. Well, that happened in Egypt. And then they had a lot of cattle there. So suddenly the cattle got sick and died. Well, that creates even a greater problem because they didn't have fish. Now the cattle are dead. I don't know whether all of them died or not, but a significant number of them did. And then with all this death and corruption around, what happens to the humans? They get the next plague. They get boils, which generally comes out of unsanitary conditions. And so this was a sad situation. They had boils. And then after boils, they had a hailstorm. What did the hail do? It beat the crops down. And so if you're a farmer, you know what hail can do. And I'm a farmer. I've seen it beat the crops down. I've seen it knock the leaves off of corn stalks to where they're just a corn stalk and a few little strings. And hail can beat your crop to death. Well, they had a hailstorm that beat the crops down. And then that wasn't bad enough. here came the locusts. And the locusts ate up what the hail didn't tear up. And so the crops are gone. So what do? Well, after that, there came a thick darkness. Well, you say, well, so, you have a week of thick darkness when the sun don't shine, and you get over that. Then you go back to normal. Well, no, because most all of the natural kingdom is based on a biological clock which depends on light and dark, spring and summer, day and night. And with the biological clock interrupted, then the entire kingdom, insect world and the avian world, the birds and all the bees and other things that are affected by natural laws of God are no longer in sync. And their reproductive cycles are interrupted, so they're gone. And now you're down to the 10th plague, which was the death of the firstborn. Well, what is left when you have a royal kingdom, but all the food is gone? Well, you've got the royal family. And now the royal family is taken away. The death of the firstborn, which included the house of Pharaoh and all the other people in Egypt, is taken away. So God has used his power with the rebellion of Pharaoh, not releasing the Hebrew people, to teach Egypt a lesson. And a lesson that was a hard, hard lesson. But it didn't end there. When these plagues occurred in Egypt, the phenomenon or the powerful part of it is they did not occur among the Israeli people or the Hebrew people at that time. It just occurred in Egypt. Now, I don't know how God separated that, because the Egyptian people and the Hebrew people were mixed up. But none of the Hebrew people had these plagues on them, and none of them had the death of the firstborn. Of course, God had given Moses instructions how to handle that. You had the beginning of the Passover. But this total ravishing of Egypt had occurred without touching the one hair of the families of the Hebrew nation. They were intact and packed and ready to go. Finally, in this thick darkness that occurred and then the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh sent after Moses and said, y'all come in here quick. He said, y'all take everything that belongs to you. Get out of my country. I don't want you here anymore. And but there was one thing they had forgotten that the Israelites, I keep calling them Israelites, I'm sorry, but the Hebrew nation had done. During these plagues, these Egyptians wanted the Hebrew nation out so bad that God told them, he said, you ask for their silver, their jewels, their gold, all of their precious raiments. You ask for their treasures. And the Egyptian people were so willing for the Hebrews to get out of there, they gave them to it. And so not only did they leave the country desolate and despair, they took all the gold out of Egypt when they went into the wilderness. You wonder where they got the gold to build the tabernacle and build the ark? This is where. It came out of Egypt. The Israelites didn't have anything. Remember, they were poor slaves. When they came out of Egypt, they had their wagons loaded down with Egyptian wealth. And they had their cattle, they had their sheep and goats, and they had food and bread. They even had it so unready to travel till they carried it on their shoulders. In their mixing bowls. They just got the food off the table out of the kitchen and put it on their back and took a hike. And they walked on over to the Red Sea. And they got there and they saw the Red Sea, and then all of a sudden they noticed the Pharaoh's army coming behind them. And they almost panicked. Moses said, just hang on, everything's going to be all right. And so he went to the Red Sea, put his rod across the sea. God sent an east wind all night long. It blew till it dried out, not only the water, but the ground under the water. And such a trail that the children of Israel could go across it in one night. Now that trail, and we have to do a little math on this, and I won't ask you to do that, but that trail had to be at least a half-mile wide, because there were a lot of people coming out of Egypt in the Hebrew nation. In fact, the numbers are this. There were 603,550 of the men that were able to go fight. Now, if you multiply each one of these men as having a family with at least 5 people in it, times 5, and you come out with about 3 million people, maybe 3,500,000. So that's how many people came out of Egypt that day and crossed over the Red Sea in one day and one night, and came out on the eastern side into the land of the wilderness. Well, Pharaoh's army came very fast, and they also went down into the chasm that God had dried out for the Hebrew people. And when they got down in the bottom, God caused the wheels of the chariots to fall off, and they couldn't drag their chariots out. And when I keep calling them Israelites, I apologize, but the Hebrew people came out on the eastern side, and all of a sudden the waters came back together, and it drowned the army of Pharaoh. And their horses and their chariots were covered over with water. And it was a great, great deliverance, and the Hebrew people were saved on the eastern side. And we were about out of time. I'll mention one other thing. They traveled on up for a few days to the place called Marah, about a month, and they got there and they were out of water, because you can just carry so much water in the desert when you're using it every day. And they had their livestock, and so they murmured to Moses for water. Well, Moses said, we'll get it at Marah. That place got its name from the kind of water they found there. It was bitter. They couldn't drink it. In fact, some thought it maybe he was poison water. But Moses asked God about it, and God said, well, just put this bush in it, and it'll sweeten it up. And he did, and it sweetened the water. And so the Hebrew nation, over 3 million people, drunk water out of that spring in Marah. And later they went on further down. They went to Elim, a place where they had 70 palm trees, and they ran out of water again, a place called Rephidim. And they murmured for water, and God told Moses, he said, well, speak to the rock, strike it, and it'll give you water. Well, he did, and water came out of a rock. And this rock must have been a mammoth rock, because it took enough